Good evening. My name is Ingrid Schroder. I'm the director of the AA. For people who don't already know me, there's some extraordinarily familiar faces here tonight. Now, I am, I think, notoriously bad at introductions. And just last night, I was watching various interviews and talks online and realized that in so many cases, a director of a school can talk for half an hour before the person you're here to see. I've always been slightly averse to kind of, going through the CV of someone who I think you all are familiar with. So I thought perhaps tonight I'd introduce a little bit of something I hope is in keeping with the nature of the book we're talking about. I've known Tom for I don't know how long. I was an undergraduate when you were in diploma. You and Steph were kicking around, doing your thing, and alongside a few other people who are here in the audience. But we came to know each other through teaching and through sort of maybe a few too many nights and late night in the pub. And I think we became a sort of, partners in crime in an aspiration to have maybe a different conversation. I think that has always been hopeful, and introduced a series of ideas that I think are run through the book that we'll be talking about tonight. And when I picked it up, and I hope this is not too candid, I sent Tom a message and I said, it's actually really readable. And, without the stress perhaps on the actually, but it is. And I think what is remarkable, and perhaps has been always remarkable in the conversations that we've had, is a level of humanity, a level of humility in the way in which we look at really a set of kind of fragile artifacts in the world around us. And out of that, maintain a fascination with architecture, with the people who make, the people who draw, and the people who write. And I can't think that there's a better moment, poised as so many of our students are, at a moment where they are about to try and describe a piece of work that they have been so intimately involved with for so long, in words that seem to fail or seem to not do justice to the agony, the many, many hours, and the very many ideas that have filtered into a project, whatever that may be. So I thought tonight is a perfect opportunity to muse on that process, the value of language, why we write for ourselves, and also the journey of going from being a student interested in things to being an adult who is still interested in things. So I'm going to hand over to you, Tom, and then if you want to present, whatever you'd like to present, and then we'll chat.
Thanks, Ingrid, and thank you all for coming this evening. I guess I don't really have a formal presentation for this, but I can sort of describe a little bit the book, how it came about, and the shape of it. I'm really pleased to say that actually some of the key collaborators in this book actually have literally just sat down, so maybe I'll start with them. We have over there Sarah Hanselman, who's the editor, who has actually been an amazing person to help put a shape to this. And I'll describe that in a second. And Adrien Vasquez, graphic designer, who's collaborator of John Morgan, who we've worked with for nearly 20 years, both in practice and in making books and websites, buildings, catalogs. So we sort of have a very long friendship, very long collaboration in these things. And that was very important. When a couple of years ago, I was, for various reasons, putting together a list of texts that I published. There's probably about double the number that are in the book, and thought, there may even be a shape to this, even though each one has been written in very, very different circumstances. The first one probably started in the late 90s, and actually was published here in AA Files in a double issue on Georges Perec in 2002. So that's the sort of the kind of more or less the outer reach of the pieces. And then over the years, I've been asked to write about this and that, either for a book or a catalogue essay or a review. And I suppose that you don't really see it taking shape as it's happening. It's only with a certain type of retrospect. And then working with Sarah, we actually sort of filleted the pieces that maybe don't travel through time as well as others. And then it ended up being a book of a dozen essays, some very short, you might read one in a bit, some slightly longer form. And they kind of go through a series of themes where maybe the first ones are about how things are made, or partly how they're made, but why they're made the way they're made. So trying to connect certain cultures of making with a kind of wider environment that produces them, and see if it's a sort of two-way street. That it includes things like a piece about the early work of Frank Gehry and its relationship to American framing and Los Angeles. Then there are some pieces by the Polish artist Monika Sosnowska. There's a couple of pieces called the Monika Papers, where she makes sculpture, incredible sculptures, which are generally derived from the kind of ruins of socialist modernism in Poland. And then they're kind of recreated, and then they're kind of distressed or crushed, these sort of steel installations. But she makes them all in paper first. So there's a very strange, kind of almost alchemical transformation between the models she makes, which are incredibly delicate, and then the actual pieces, which are really violent in their kind of distortion, breaking, twisting, and somehow trying to understand how does an artist's imagination kind of rehearse these kind of violent turns in these very delicate objects. Then there's a few pieces about drawing, which is really reflecting on what I think a lot of us do, whether we're students or in practice, almost our primary activity, and particularly looking at drawing, at working drawings, in fact. I became really interested in a sense, like the professional craft, and how, while there's a sort of shared language of architectural drafting, actually every architect leaves certain fingerprints all over their working drawings, which sort of represent their values. And so, let's say, comparing people like Peter Zumthor to Gehry, they both work with timber, but their drawings are fundamentally different. Even their pencil drawings are fundamentally different. And then those pieces about drawing kind of lead on to then a section which is maybe more about landscape and gardens. And I suppose they're the more recent ones, where partly you could say general preoccupations there are in the world about biodiversity, habitat loss, and a kind of maybe new ideas about how architecture is, in fact, a certain natural practice. And then that led to quite a lot of work invested in Milton Keynes, where we did a project that opened a MK Gallery in 2019. And the conception of Milton Keynes as a landscape structure and its proximity to Stowe, and how a certain kind of Englishness runs through from, or the argument is that Stowe leads straight into the grids of Milton Keynes. Whether that's actually a reality or not is another matter. And then a project that was going on sort of simultaneously in London, which was the studios for Jürgen Teller, which are as much garden as they are building, and how that's affected his practice as a photographer, and a kind of an idea of being very naturally situated. And then the last piece is about just gardening, or pruning in particular, which is, I think, the more kind of savage and kind of wild side of gardening. And all the pieces were, all bar one, I think, were commissioned. So they all have this sort of slightly accidental origin, and then were published in different places. So this is the first time I sort of brought them together. And then there was one piece which was not commissioned, which was just a kind of an observational piece. It was an Instagram post by Norman Foster, and I don't know if any of you follow Norman Foster's official Instagram, which is amazing. And you can have a look at it yourself later on. But it was on the 20th of March, 2020, so just as lockdown happened. And he posted this image of him working, and it just said, "Working at home like everybody else." And then I thought, that's a bold statement, Norman. So I looked into the image and then basically described everything I could see in the image by sort of zooming into it. And suddenly you realize that it's the most extraordinary career, the most extraordinary life. And if it's anything, and it's many things, it's just not like everybody else. And so it's just a little piece that was just kind of enjoying that moment where and also on his desk at the time, there was also a catalogue by David Hockney. And that was really interesting that was on part of his desk. And I thought, oh, these two kind of northern English lads who went to find the future in America, but in a very, very different way, and then sort of come back. And I kind of wondered, like, do they know each other? Are they friends, or are these just different worlds, different constellations? And I still don't know, but it doesn't really matter. It was kind of fun piece to write. And then in all of that, there is the oldest piece, which is one I mentioned at the beginning, is the one about Georges Perec's Places project. And that was the one that was in AA Files in 2002. And the piece is about a project that Georges Perec did, the novelist, where he wanted to document the passage of time affecting 12 places in Paris over 12 years. So he would write about each place once a month from memory and once in situ. And he had a kind of complicated algorithm for doing each one twice in a year. And he would put it in an envelope, seal it, and then just carry on. And then at the end, he would open all the envelopes and try to feel the aging of the places themselves, the aging of his memories, how they changed over time, and how his writing changed over time. Now, he stopped, it failed, and then he went from there to write Life a User's Manual, which is like his great work. But nevertheless, these pieces are very beautiful, let's say, exercises in observation, observations, very short, kind of short form writing. And I realized that when I needed to do a bit of a rewrite for that one, for the book, which kind of guided by Sarah, that I had spent more time with this piece than Georges Perec had with his project. And actually, it was going to age me more than it ever did him. So somehow, the piece I wrote about him ended up being kind of wrapped into his own process. So then it kind of came together. Maybe the last comment I would say about it is the design of the book, which is by John Morgan's studio, but then really led by Adrián and Teresa Lima, who's based in Portugal, and which was, one of the nicest processes, because you sort of have a series of Word documents, you have folders with pictures, and then they somehow explore what Georges Perec called the space of the page, and each piece has its own kind of structure, even its own paper, and incredibly meticulous typography, sometimes very rigorous, sometimes very loose. And I remember it was about this time last year when John Morgan came over to our studio and sort of had the first ideas for how to do the book. And he sort of said, and I've got some ideas about the cover. And he had done 10 years before Never Modern, little white, kind of off-white, sort of almost like a French novel in its kind of design. And he said, never mind, that's far too tasteful and elegant. It's going to be very shiny and it's going to be brown. And the text is going to be orangey red. I was like, wow, John, that's a bold move. And then during the process of design, occasionally I would send a little signal of doubt out to the design team, saying, are you sure about this kind of orangey red on brown? Maybe like grey on brown? And then I had several emails back from everything. I goes, no, I think we're very confident with the red on brown. And I thank them for that, because they've gone much further with it than I could have imagined. And then just a little anecdote, if anybody gets the book and has a look inside, the inside flaps holding the covering, they are in fact inspired by the instructions of how to fold a burrito, which John sent me a picture on WhatsApp while he was cooking supper for his kids. So that's how that's come about. But it's been a kind of amazing process with Sarah and Adrien, Teresa, Pop Books in Zurich, who are a publisher who still seem to really love making books, which is a real privilege. So that's a little bit, in a kind of nutshell, the story of the book.
Yeah, I mean, I have so many questions, and they're sort of teamed with the book itself. And I think when I first opened this and I said, it's actually quite readable, I think there's something. It's also highly personal without having you in the middle of it. And I think the first thing is obviously the work on Gehry and LA, for me, has been a theme that has run throughout our conversations over however long I can remember. I think it was also through Max that I first watched sketches of Gehry. But there is something about, Norman Foster, all of these people who went out to the US to find freedom. And the people that know your work won't immediately go like, yeah, Frank Gehry, LA. And I think it might be worth expanding on, your romance with Los Angeles, which is ongoing with Laurie being there, and this kind of extraordinary work that I think people are unfamiliar with in terms of Frank Gehry.
Yeah, I went to LA the first time in 2004. In fact, it was a unit trip. It was when I was teaching here. It was a unit trip with Dip 2. I don't know who has Dip 2 these days, but that was our team at the time, with Peter Beard. And we went to LA, and I have to admit I was very skeptical. I've always really enjoyed the East Coast US, particularly New York, and I've never owned a car, and I thought that I would go to LA and be sort of slightly look down my nose at it as a sort of, non-car driving European. And almost immediately, I just found the place completely enthralling, amazing. And I think it was the absence of any sort of European urban reference point, any centrality, any kind of civic structure, the sort of the kind of the random clash of scales, of uses, and it somehow felt like, everything is possible here, especially excess but it's and then got to know the early work of Gehry, so particularly his own house in Santa Monica, which is, I think, the best of its type anywhere. And then there's a series of galleries and houses from the late 70s into the early 80s, the Gemini GL Gallery on Melrose, Indiana Ave, a series of 3 houses.
Do you want to show some images from it?
Oh, we can, yeah. So these images, which are in the book, they are actually where's the full screen? There we go. So this is just a PDF of the book, a low-res PDF. Adrien, I'm sorry. It's one of the proofs you sent me. So this is the LA piece. And at the end, so these are photographs from about 2015 or 16 by a photographer called Johan Dellin, a Swedish photographer who's also an architect. And so he went back, I suppose, 35 years after they're built. And they're very cheap. They were, and they're incredibly inventive. This is the Spiller house. This is actually on the left is Mrs. Spiller, Jane Spiller, who commissioned Gehry, coming up onto the roof terrace. This is also the courtyard in the Spiller house. The thing that I found really thrilling about these projects was the way that they just used the most commonly available commercial vernacular. So essentially, all these buildings you could build from a couple of trips to your average timber merchant, your builder's merchant, corrugated metal, stud work, a bit of drywall, and they're all built in this incredibly normal way. So basically all you need is a good carpenter. And it's built exactly the way that all the other anonymous houses in LA are built. And I thought, oh wow, this is the only place where the sort of the most experimental, the most kind of imaginative architecture is actually the same stuff as all the ordinary things. And I thought that's kind of an amazing, it's a very small section of architecture that does that. Usually the kind of the very refined, let's say, very refined and maybe kind of original architecture is often quite apart from the mainstream. This is absolutely embedded within it. And that's something, I guess, that is probably not aesthetically similar, but some of the early projects we were doing, particularly things like South London Gallery and things like that, where it was, it was low budget in a kind of, funny corners of South London. The means were quite basic, but there was a certain way of doing things. And we had a great contractor, a guy called John Perkins, again, somebody that we've worked with for 25 years now. Mm-hmm. And, their ability to just do really amazing little turns out with quite modest means. So this work has always been a touchstone. And the way that it reflects LA more generally. And there were a couple of little anecdotes with it. One was a contractor in LA on one of the hills doing I think a house for a Hollywood star. Amazing. One thing is in LA, construction sites, unlike the ones here, you can still just walk into them. I did it last Christmas. There was an interesting looking building, half built. So I just went inside, met the guy, showed me around, showed me the tools and the new solar panels. And they, it's just, they seem to be very open if you're interested. And then this contractor just went sweeping an arm sort of across the plains of LA. And he said, see all that? All done with a skill saw. Yeah. And it was kind of, and I really like the way that he said it because it has that sort of, I don't know, that kind of construction site aphorisms, which I always really like, the way that you can somehow sort of bundle quite complex things into these sort of general statements. And then so a lot of that work has kind of, I suppose, the spirit of the work, I hope, is we've tried to work with, and then tried to write about it, and also the people, also try and include into it the people who maybe represent Los Angeles as a phenomena as well as possible, and then those, let's say, the two I would kind of hold, let's say, as the best exemplars, partly because they're practicing at the same time as this kind of work, would be Ed Ruscha and Joan Didion. Mm. And Joan Didion's kind of passage, particularly in Play It As It Lays, essentially whenever the main character, who has a lot of problems, needs to sort out her problems, she just gets in her car and then drives to the end of the highway, and then everything is sorted out. And then she gets to the end of the highway and then describes the scenes, and you kind of go, of course that's LA. And it's just so. Yes, I probably also have a romantic Brit's view of LA, which I was teased about by a New Yorker who said, "What is it with you English and LA?" I don't get it, but anyway.
It's like the long legacy of Raina Banham. It's haunting you. But I think also I remember when you did the Ed Ruscha show, and that felt like a moment of, LA coming to you, it being incredibly intimidating, and this extraordinary, the coolest guy one could possibly imagine, somehow landing in London, and you tasked with exhibiting his work.
Yeah, that was a really that was in 2009, I think, so quite a long time ago. Retrospective at the Hayward of Ruscha's paintings, and that was an amazing process to somehow, be able to get under the surface of things that you're kind of quite familiar with. Let's say from various exhibitions, there's some in Tate and stuff like that, but suddenly go into a deep dive and try and understand his relationship to the city, to painting, to words, because words are like amazing. And I think that Steph and I had an amazing time just immersing in that world. And then actually a few years later, we went back to another study trip to LA, about 2014, and we got in touch and he said, "Remember, we designed your show in London. Could we visit your studio?" And he was very, very kind. And he said, "Oh, yeah, I remember that show. That was nice. Yeah, come on." It was a slightly longer exchange than that, but he was very, very generous. And somehow it was on the first day of the visit as well. Oh, so it sort of set the scene for then the rest of the trip. And then now our son lives there, which just makes it perfect, because then we have an excuse to go back.
It's almost unreal that you produce a child to somehow manifest your dream.
We had 18 years to brainwash him into moving out there. But he's there working.
But it's such an extraordinary place. And, I always quote to people, I think it was Christopher Isherwood who said, the thing about LA is you can change everything by just changing the lights. And, we think of it as huge, massive, sprawling city, the motorways, but there is this fragility and immediacy and temporality to it that I think is very much embedded in the work of Frank Gehry, but somehow has a correlation also with the Monika papers. I mean, we talked a bit earlier about, how light and delicate something can be made to then represent something that is kind of almost violent in its permanence. And that parallel, I think, works really nicely with your understanding of LA and the combination. Perhaps that's by accident, or you're excellent editors.
I suppose no. I think that was that. Once we knew where the opening was with LA. And actually, this is another bit of the process where the collaboration was great. It was Sarah who said, "Tough Love," the piece about gardening, that's the end. Yeah. And that was a sort of, so then they become fixed points, and then you sort of then try and join it together. And then these are images of models. Actually, this first piece is images of models that Monika Sosnowska makes in her studio. And the piece is specifically about the model making, which is amazing. This is a 2008 piece that she did for the Venice Biennale, which was a replica of this very famous modernist art pavilion in Warsaw that was destroyed in the kind of commercial redevelopment post after kind of 89. And the original pavilion is a bit bigger than the gallery space they have in Venice, and she just rebuilt it and then crushed it and stuffed it in. And it's a really, she's very, very, really precise and insightful. She takes a lot of photographs of like urban photography, sort of, and really precise documenting of, let's say, the decay of modernism and the lack of care of what had been the most optimistic, one of the most optimistic periods in Poland after the war, and then which ended in a kind of a failure of sorts. And so she makes a lot of these, usually they're usually fragments of modernity that then get distorted, crunched. She did one of the Zhukov towers, you know, these kind of helical radio towers, and there's one in Moscow, and by the engineer Zhukov, and basically she made a replica of it and then broke it in half and then stuffed it into the Garage Museum in Moscow. That was the last time I saw her. That was in February 2021 or 22, just before the war. Yeah. And apparently she doesn't know where it is, what's happened to it. It's kind of, so it's a story of its times in multiple ways. And then she has these incredible fabricators who are basically generally quite elderly, who are people who learned their metalwork crafts in the kind of socialist period. And then they use wrenches and tractors and diggers to then distort and twist all these things. And she just comes along with these very, very fragile little hanging models like this. And then they kind of do it in this really kind of powerful way. And she was saying that most of them are retiring, like these people aren't around anymore. Yeah. But she said that she's found this new source of super precise skilled labor. Bicycle makers, like young guys who make like these very hip bike frames. Yeah. And apparently they're the ones who, they have the skill, the precision in making, but also they're totally into her work. Yeah. And they totally get that this is like a really cool, crazy thing to do. Yeah. So there's these old guys who basically teach them the tricks of the distortions, and then there's these kind of young bike makers who actually then are now taking over the fabrication process. So from it being, let's say, a relic of socialism, and it's now sort of this kind of part of a kind of hipster economy. It's hipster kind of
tech.
Yeah. It's a really, and then this piece. The second piece there is called "This Is Not a Pipe," and this piece, just to give you a sense of scale, is probably about 1.5 meters tall, maybe about a meter diameter, and probably about 10 millimeters thick. And it's a piece of sort of gas pipeline, and it looks like it's torn. But of course, it's not torn. This is like half-inch steel plate. So it's been burnt with an oxyacetylene torch and then kind of rolled as if it's been torn. And somehow, again, it has this kind of relationship to paper. And a piece by Brassai that actually I think I first saw in an exhibition by Richard Wentworth in Thinking Aloud. Long time ago, but suddenly this is it's called a sculpture involontaire, and it's basically rolling bus tickets in your pocket that then produces this kind of tear in the paper, and I suddenly went, was that what she was that the kind of thinking involved? So the piece is sort of about why this is not a pipe,
But I think there's an amazing tangible materiality and understanding of the found object or the made object. In some ways, it makes me leap way forward to some of the work on the MK Gallery, not because of its relationship to Stowe and landscape. And I love how you go from Joan Didion to sort of Thomas Jefferson. And that's the magic of the book. But last time you were here, we were talking about high tech.
Yeah. And
that was an extraordinary conversation, not just because of the hilarity of Patty not remembering you at all, but that goes to another part of the story. But the importance of this kind of architecture as it informed your own kind of architectural upbringing and how you've returned to it over time, and then also its relevance to the students that you're teaching now, I thought was a really amazing set of observations that I think are quite well played out in the MK.
Yeah, that was, so that's been a sort of another kind of these sort of long, slow fascinations. Yeah. One is sort of about the picturesque and how that's kind of corrupted minds, particularly through modernity. Milton Keynes, which we got to know very slowly over many years. I mean, when I first went, really didn't get it. And then with the help of actually mainly people who've grown up there, people who were part of creating it. So, you know, when we were designing this building and we were doing, you know, the consultation for planning, you know, there would be Derek Walker at the back of the room, which, for those of you that don't know, there's no reason why you should. Derek Walker was the sort of great impresario of the whole designing, conceiving of Milton Keynes, or one of them, and a very, very kind of important, imposing figure. And he would be there at these consultations, sort of gently nodding, you know, this might be allowed in his town. And of course, yes, it's somehow, when you're working there, it reawakens certain ideas of high tech and how it got played out, particularly in Milton Keynes, where it was much more part of a social project. Yeah. And then, as you say, so my very first job in architecture was working for Hopkins. And there was a book launch a few weeks ago, or a few months ago, for a book on preserving high-tech architecture. And Patty Hopkins was there, and I was invited to the panel because I'd worked there. And then about a minute before we sat down for the panel conversation, Patty said, "I don't remember you," which was a little, I'd been specifically invited because I'd worked there. So it was a little bit of a kind of, became the sort of joke of the evening. But of course it made total sense because I was very young. I was the youngest person in the office. And so I was looking and listening at everything. Yeah. And of course, she was running the practice with Michael and had lots of things to worry about, but the kid was not one of them. Yeah. So it totally makes sense that she didn't remember me, but I totally remembered. Actually, maybe that's a good segue. That wasn't planned, but the good segue. I was going to read one piece from the book, the shortest one, which is exactly about that period, and maybe explains why she doesn't remember me. But this piece is called Blue, and it was written 2017 for a magazine called Blue Review, also designed by John Morgan's studio, for a place called Blue Mountain School in Schroder, which is a project that we did with the office. And they produced their own little publication, very beautiful little thing. And they said, would you write a text about the color blue? Which is not one of my specialist subjects. But anyway, I had a go, and it's called Blue. Architect's Office, London, NW1, summer 1990. A van delivers a box of dry lines to the office. More than 100 A1 line drawings made on tracing paper and copied 4 times to be sent out to contractors today. They have to be checked and collated into 4 piles, then folded 3 times so the bottom right-hand corner, showing the drawing number, faces out as an A4 sheet. As the youngest in the office, it's my job to fold, count, and pile. I like the strong smell of ammonia. It feels professional. This is architecture. Fresh die lines are crisp blue traces of off-white on an off-white background, like negatives of the traditional blueprint. The drawing has to be made with ink on thick tracing paper or film to allow light to pass through onto photosensitive diazo paper. The bluish cast across the die line varies slightly with each batch, perhaps because of the differences in paper thickness or the age of the chemicals. But it doesn't matter, as the freshness will not last long. Old die lines around the office have yellowed or darkened, depending on their age. Their sharp lines have faded too, like old tattoos. Paste-ups of labels or diagrams leave traces of the invisible tape holding them in position. Folding a die line is a skill, more like the complex sequence of folding a map. The blue cast of a die line paper creates an extra dry surface against fingertips. The feeling is pleasant at first, as each neat crease emits a little heat into the fingernails during the folding. Friction soon turns to light abrasion, but the lightheadedness from ammonia eases the task. The blueprint is smell and touch more than it is color. Later that summer, the first CAD station arrived at the office. I think I have not seen a new die line since. At least I have not folded one. Now there is no smell. There are no die lines, and there is no blue. And that was, let's say, like the first. It's probably also the most autobiographical piece because it was like the first encounter with architecture, which is not designing an art center in South Korea, or, all on your own based on concepts and late nights. It's actually much more mundane, but it was totally exciting. And, that's where I learned how to draw. That's where I learned how to use a scale ruler. That's how, and it was right on that cusp of when the digital came knocking. And so that was also made it a very kind of interesting moment.
But I think this also goes back to two things which kind of are strung throughout the book, which is writing, language, and drawing. And I think what is remarkable in this piece is the sense that, to fold a drawing is to sort of be in architecture. And how do we know we're architects if all we're doing is sitting at a computer? So, what those kind of working drawings are, kind of construction drawings are, as also a way of reading a set of intentions, I think is embedded in the heart of the book, like right in the middle. I don't know if you'd like to say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so in the middle of the book, there's the pieces which are essentially about working drawings. Yeah. And there's one piece where I was invited to curate an exhibition in the Serralves Museum in Porto, designed by Alvaro Siza. And maybe about a decade ago, his archive was split, and part of it is in the CCA in Canada, part of it is in drawing matter, and part of it is in the Serralves Museum. And they started a program where they would invite a practicing architect, contemporary practicing architect who they thought had an affinity with Caesar's work, to go into the archive and then curate a little exhibition from the archive. And probably many people know Caesar's drawings mainly as sketches, these very sort of very beautiful. I mean, he draws like an angel. In fact, he draws a lot of angels as well. These very kind of lyrical, fluid sketches, often done on site. And they somehow have created a kind of an idea of this person with with this kind of sort of just intuitive, poetic gift for space and landscape and so on. When you actually look at his drawings, he's an incredibly precise draftsman. And the working drawings of his early career, so before he had an office, when they were made by lots of other people, so the very early projects in Porto, they are super professional. It's almost like it's like another Caesar who is really interested in doing the right job. And I became really fascinated by that, because I guess that's not how we know him first. And then the materiality of the drawings, because these were before the revolution, so before 1974, when Portugal still had a lot of colonial ties, and they had this essentially an abundance of African hardwoods, Angolan hardwoods. So the craftsmanship and the detail is incredible in the early work. And so I was really interested in really trying to tease out that story in his career. And while I was doing it, I suddenly became really nervous about it. If I can go up. Because I was curating, this is one of the Bayerische House, or this is one of my favorites, the agricultural cooperative in Porto, that I was curating the show, and actually his office is, 10 minutes walk away. And and it seems very odd to be meddling in somebody's kind of back catalogue. So close to, so they arranged for me to go and meet him. I went to meet him a couple of times, and on Saturdays, and he was as charming and brilliant and generous as the reputation would set. He's actually sitting in his own window there, in that building. It's a picture from site. There's another one of him. Lots of photographs of him on site. That's him in the black. But it was the drawings I was mainly interested in. And I went to see him and I said, look, I'm really interested in your drawings, but not in your sketches. I want to talk about the working drawings. And then he basically just started goes, you know what? Hinges, really difficult. Hinges are really difficult, and particularly timber hinges, because you have to they all have to be made and assembled with exactly the right moisture content, so that when you can get them together, and then you need one part of the joint needs to be drier than the other part, so that when it reabsorbs the moisture, it locks it in. And then he kind of goes, yeah, but the carpenters in Porto, they know all this stuff because they used to be boat builders, whereas the carpenters in Lisbon, really, they don't know anything. They like a bit of limestone. So he became super precise about these really kind of geeky bits of architecture, and kind of go, oh yeah, they're the things that we kind of worry about day to day at work. You know, how do you make that fit with that? How do you make that opening? And suddenly it felt like we were completely on the same page. And the other thing that was funny, he was drawing all the way through. Yep. And smoking incessantly, which is kind of very well known for. And he had this 1960s cast aluminium ashtray on his desk and loads of scorch marks on his desk. And this cast aluminium ashtray, quite a little bit kind of bashed up around the edges. It's obviously been there a long time. And he smoked, I was there for not quite a whole day, but most of a day. He must have gone through at least a packet of cigarettes. And when I left, I looked at the ashtray, and there wasn't a single bit of ash in the ashtray. It had all just sort of dissipated into the room. I was like, that is a hell of a move. No, he was wonderful, and he spoke just so precisely about construction. You kind of go, so inside this person that we associate with being kind of very lyrical, and there is somebody who actually takes the discipline incredibly seriously and precisely. And it's wonderful. I discovered this building, which is from 1960. This is this agricultural cooperative in the centre of Porto, which weirdly is sort of not in most of the monographs, anthologies, and it's an incredible building. And I still, to my mind, it's been messed around with quite a bit. But nevertheless, I've never understood why it's not in, the Can of the Greats with the pools, the tea house. It's around that period, a little bit after. So also I was kind of interested in somehow getting that project into play and into the kind of Siza world.
Now, I mean, for people who haven't looked at the book, it'll feel like we're jumping around sort of at random. And I think that that's also an important characteristic, and not to even be even more candid, but our text exchange when I said it was actually quite readable. And I think you said something like, well, that's because I can't do, I said, you tell a good story. And you said, that's because I can't do theory. And I said, well, maybe theory is for people who can't tell stories. Mm-hmm. But I think that's actually, we had the writing prize yesterday here, and there is a really interesting question about, why we write, what we write. I think we had a conversation about how few footnotes there are in this thing. Mm. So it's as I said before, it's highly personal without being about you. And that's a very fragile balance of how to maintain a level of enthusiasm that can be contagious, because I know we share some former students in the audience, and I know how contagious some of these obsessions were and still are. But where writing comes into that and storytelling becomes a way of talking about architecture that is not capital A academic, and consciously not, but still has is a sort of honest fascination with a set of topics that don't have to hang together.
I mean, I think that's also, maybe it doesn't reflect all architects, but I think it reflects certainly quite a few, including me, Steph, and lots of our collaborators, but also many friends, that our interests are not kind of singularly aligned. They are quite a wide range of things, from literature, architecture, the work of artists, the work of photographers, relationships to clients, to places. And as you say, I sort of feel like, although I've been teaching for a long time, I feel like as an architect that's in teaching, I don't feel like I need to do that kind of very academic writing. There are other people who will do it much better. So I think my relationship to writing perhaps is, I was thinking this a few days ago, it might be almost a little bit old-fashioned, that when I was a student, it was quite common for practicing architects you were interested in would also write a lot. You know, people like Moneo, Cahoon, Miller, Rossi, and actually I remember Tony's piece on Caesar when I was a student, and that was really surprising that somehow we knew his work, the work of his practice, and then suddenly we read the piece about the pools, which was about changing. And again, it wasn't an academic piece, it was about going from the high street, if I remember this correctly, the transformation that happens as you go through the building and essentially strip your clothes off and then come out of the other side of the building against the rocks and the horizon. And it's like, that was like an amazing way, like it was a very different way of reading about architecture than perhaps, let's say, historians, and which is, you know, it's not a kind of value judgment. It's just, oh, that's another architect writing about things. And I think it just has a different engine to, like, you know, critics, professional writers, and things like that. Also, there's slightly less pressure because it's kind of, you know, it's not my main job, you know. So, you know, it's like it's really great if people like them, but it's not. I don't feel like they necessarily need to bring closure to a subject or have a kind of absence. So they have quite a lot of loose ends in them. They're a bit, and they're kind of quite speculative. I would say they're much more in the tradition of essays, of trying something, throwing a few ideas out, seeing if you can string the words together to make them kind of hold together. Yeah. And then, you know, and then seeing whether that connects with people.
I think it's a very indirect way of understanding your own work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's two pieces in here which involve our own work. There's the Milton Keynes one, which is sort of about Milton Keynes, about Stowe, but it does, you know, it goes through some of the stories of Milton Keynes. These are sort of archive pictures, but then it does end in the project that we did. And then there is, oh, there you go, there's the Norman Foster image. Yeah, okay. Just like your lockdown, right? Did you have a couple of models in your office as well? And then there was one which is about the studio that we designed for Jürgen Teller and his work. And it was quite interesting. He had a big exhibition in Paris just over a year ago. And then he asked me to write something about his work. And I was like, yeah, that would be great. And I was starting to think about it. And then as the deadline came, he sort of said, how's the essay about my studio? And I'm going, that's not what you asked me to write about. He goes, no, but I want you to write about what it's like to design a studio for me. I was like, I've written about something else. And so I went back and I then tried to thread through. And so the essay is trying to do both. So it kind of goes between the actual process of doing it and then also the pictures, the work that he makes in it. And these are two. This is one of the gardens and one of the interiors.
It's also one of the few places where you figure, and then also it's very funny.
Yeah, well, he's a kind of very interesting. He's a very interesting and very funny guy, and these two I really like because they're both shot in the studio, and it's Vivienne Westwood on the left. And on the right is Andreas Kronhaller, who's her husband, who is lying on a carpet with embroidered in it a picture of Vivienne Westwood, and they're both in the same position. This is one of the last pictures of Vivienne Westwood before she died, so it has a kind of pathos to it. They were long-term partners, and she is then sort of hiding behind the wilting tetrapanic leaf that comes from one of the gardens. And somehow they were taken at different times, but somehow the building sort of holds them together. And it was a very special process designing it, but it was also very special to just watch how the place and the pictures and the gardens keep on producing these new things. So these ones are, this one is more or less on the left is a curator, Francesco Bonami, very soon after the building was finished. So you can see that the planting is barely started. And then the one on the right is the same space of Marina Abramovich when she had the exhibition here at the Royal Academy. Several years later, where the gardens have grown enormously. And then there is one, and the piece starts with this, there is one of me. And then next to me is a figurine of Jürgen Teller on the plate. And Teller in German means plate. And he goes, and behind me there is floorboards, they're floor panels that cover up a service trench in the studio. And there was some maintenance going on the day I was there for the photograph. And they were open for some maintenance. And he went, Tom, you're the architect, go and sit in the trench. I was like, okay, yeah, I know what's going on here. You're going to... and then he made some, I can't remember what it was, some stupid comment about the blinds not working or something like that. And then I looked up and, looked up and started waving around at the ceiling, which is that one there. And then I went and tested them, and they worked absolutely fine. He just wanted me to look up in the air and wave my hands around. So it was kind of like, I just go, okay, so that's how you do your thing. You sort of distract, you get your subjects to not be aware that there is, that these pictures are being made. So that was one of the only pieces where I've written about the work of the practice. Where it's kind of threaded through. But on the whole, I find that a really hard thing to do, really hard to write about. In fact, I find it much nicer to write about other people's work because you get to know it much better. And sometimes with your own work, you don't really want to know it better. In fact, you want it to recede a little bit.
But this whole thing about the personal and being introspective, I think, is so apt, particularly as students and who may be in the room, preparing for the presentation of projects, etc. How do you describe something that one can be fascinated with, but it isn't all about you? And I think actually the last piece, this idea also of pruning and tough love, has tremendous resonance, obviously, for architects, but I think also for students and also for your teaching.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I can even actually...
Yeah, that would be great.
Really, so this is a piece that was written for a landscape architect and gardener called Danny Gantz in Zurich, who I've worked with a lot at ETH, and particularly we have a garden project that's ongoing. It was for a monograph of his practice, and he asked a few people to write kind of short pieces. And so I wrote this piece for that book. It's called Tough Love. Architects love gardening, but mainly as a metaphor. Notions of growth, decay, and renewal enrich the discipline with poetic abstraction that help us imagine other worlds, other ways of making and designing. The parallels between architecture and the garden are ancient. To imagine the building as a garden or the garden as a house has accompanied both disciplines since the mythical wall enclosed a patch of ground for cultivation. More recent architect-gardener metaphors have introduced the much-needed values of care and caution to temper revolutionary zeal of modernism or the defensive retreat of postmodernism. The architect's metaphorical gardens stand for an idealized nature, a benign environment away from the violence and cruelties of everyday life, where the spirit not only finds solace, but also myth, allegory, politics, and even satire. The garden is the world in living form, yet protected from its total force. It's the architect's metaphorical garden, that is, But in the architect's metaphorical garden, there is no late frost to kill spring shoes. There are no droughts or floods, only a giving nature. The metaphorical gardens are conveniently needs no work. The gardener is the guardian of the metaphor, a gentle soul who will protect and enhance architecture's perfection in nature. The metaphor is sadly mostly visual, which is why the picturesque is an idea most associated with landscape. And while it is only a short chapter in landscape history, its conceptual action was with us long, long ago and still remains. But have you seen a gardener pruning in February? It's a scene of shocking violence and resilience. Cutting back is brutal, almost cruel, if you do not know the inner life of trees. Work is hard. Trees are bare, the air is cold. Earth is heavy and waterlogged, if not frozen solid. Birdsong is still far away. Why is so much harm brought upon these fragile stems? The real gardener cuts the metaphor just like they cut the excess branches that will enable a new life force of spring. The wise gardener is tough in thought and action. Feet on the ground, or in the ground to be precise. The year ahead will pass through their rough fingertips. Communicating is direct and unsentimental. The gardener is in nature, not looking at nature. Their actions are natural and far from gentle. Cut, weed, thin, sow, spread, till. The work is decisive, easily upsetting the architect's inclination for compositional hesitations. It is marked by embodied knowledge and trust in what has yet to come. The real gardener is the opposite of the architect or the metaphorical gardener. They do not build, they do not fix things in time or place. They strip to raw structure and redistribute so that the garden may grow back stronger. They may use a plan, but it's just that, a plan, an intention. The real design has already been done in genetic code for growth, in the sedimentation of organic and mineral matter into geology, and in the movement of clouds, rain, wind, and sunshine. That is the gardener's meta-architecture. Composition will be completed during the seasons of plenty and their busy crowds. Birds, insects will buzz and sing as they work, guided and seduced by color and scent. People will wander and wander, picnic and sleep. The storms and gales will come, and the gardener has to prepare for them too, as they will not spare the weak. The gardener's task is physically tough, yet full of unspoken communication. As we search for ways to respond to the big questions of our time, it is right to look to gardening for new and natural ways of working and communicating with the world. And the architect is right to imagine gardening as an act of love. We just have to accept how tough that love needs to be.
Thanks so much, Tom.
Thank you.
I think that might be the perfect moment to open up to some questions from the audience. Any first questions?
Tom, that was terrific. You speak lovingly about the people that work with you, and you mentioned your builder that you'd worked with for many years. And I'm just really interested in that connection between those that take our paper dreams and turn them into reality. I'm also really interested about that conversation in Los Angeles with the guy with the skill saw, saying everything out there is made with this saw, and obviously the recent history of exactly what happens when everything's made out of wood. Just to say, I'm sure Norman and David Hockney may have met, but more probably Peter Smithson, because he was from County Durham and Hockney's from, Bridlington. So, yeah, just to say, what's your thoughts about the people you've worked with who realise your work?
No, that's a really nice question, because it's sort of, I suppose that's in the... that's kind of in the heart of the book. I mean, we work with so many people, and it's, there are the builders, the contractors, some of whom we work with over and over and over again, like John Perkins projects, who built Okini in 2001, as well as... Oh, he's over there, next to Steph. There you go. So there, the proof is right there. My partner Steph, and there's John right there. And we've done, I think, about 20 projects thereabouts. And actually, with many of the same crew, or at least the people that work for John, some of them, for a very, very long time. Others is much more, let's say, it's not personal. It's much more industrialized, particularly things like design and build projects, where it's systems of subcontracts and people come and go, and you occasionally meet them, but the connective tissue is less there. But I've always really enjoyed going to sites and somehow seeing how the skills get played out spatially, physically, and so on. And it's sort of, building is an amazing, it's super complicated process, and keeping it all together is always just. And it's also, I think, as an architect, one of the most exciting things is something that you may have possibly drawn many times, and then it's built, and it's always weird. You think you know what it's like, and you do know what it's like. You've made models, you've done drawings. Somehow it's been really fully simulated. But walking in it is a completely different sensation, and that's kind of amazing.
Richard has the
Tom,
microphone.
Yeah.
This is a bit cheap, which is my only way of apologising. But you're a grown-up now.
Thank you.
And you also like language, so you know that grown up is much more interesting than the tedious word adult. And taking that as a model, and you referred to theory, the word research, which has a kind of strange self-importance. And I remember Piers once saying to me, some men sat around in the 50s and went, architecture, science or art? And then Piers saying, oh dear, they went for science. But my point really is that you're a finder-outer, you're not a researcher. And I want you to tell everybody the description that you once told me of sitting, I'm guessing maybe 7 years old, I think in your mother's car, and discovering something that how you could be effective inside the car. And it involves heat and I think you know what I'm talking about.
I do, and there are members of my family here, so can I see?
Go for it.
Well, I mean, the incident involves a Renault 12. No, the owner of that car is correcting. No, it wasn't the Renault 5. It was the Renault 12. It was after the Renault 5. I remember I melted it. Basically, I remember it was at the time when there were cigarette lighters in cars, where you would press them in and you'd get this sort of little spiraling red hot kind of piece to light your cigarette while you were driving, of course. And I remember pressing it and just finding it fascinating, the heat and stuff. And the Renault 12 had vinyl seats over a foam padding. And the cigarette lighter, when you heat it up and you place it on the vinyl seat, just drops through in the most incredibly satisfying way. So anyway, I sort of did a bit of a Gruyere cheese out of the passenger seat, and then it left a slightly different kind of imprint on the dashboard, which was solid plastic. Like it didn't go through it, but it would just leave its sort of little circular marks. So that was a kind of early experiments in construction, which I did tell you, Richard. And yes, the owner of the car is behind you. I'm sorry.
Oh, I see a hand. Just there.
Could you say something about the title, please? I don't know if you touched on it.
No, you didn't.
Oh no,
It's very
haven't.
mysterious.
So, Dirty Old River is the title of an essay in the middle of the book about London. And it was an essay that was commissioned by Frieze magazine. In fact, this one was just after the pandemic, when we were first allowed out again. And they wanted to do a piece where they asked architects and artists to write about their favorite artwork or building in London. It was sort of assuming that everybody would be back out in the city again, and it would be fun to kind of share like what your favorite things are. And I was kind of not so interested in just picking a building or an artwork. So I picked the Thames, and partly because I walked along the Thames a lot during lockdown. And so I knew there was a certain route that I knew really, really well. And I would sort of go along it and sort of make observations along the way, kind of not very rigorous ones, because there was plenty of, I knew there were plenty of guidebooks and things like that that could do the sort of, the people and dates in the right order, but more just making little observations about it. And it was in spring, so it was about all of that. And then when I was coming back around and going under Waterloo Bridge, then I thought of Waterloo Sunset, the song by the Kinks. And the opening line of Waterloo Sunset is Dirty Old River. And then I just thought, that's probably the best 3 words about London. If you were only given 3, I think those ones in that order probably do it best. And then as it sort of stuck, and then when we were putting the book together, it was a question of then sort of somehow extracting a title, and then that was the one, because I guess maybe it also stands for the fact that although it's about LA, Warsaw, Milton Keynes, Porto, other places, I think they're always written from the point of view of a Londoner. So I think that there's a certain sort of acknowledging that if it's not about London, it's somebody looking from outside at these places, at these processes.
I can probably move faster.
Thank you. I read, as you know, it's the first piece on LA, and I must say I think it's a wonderful piece for a number of reasons. One of which is that it does something wonderful as far as Gehry is concerned, which is to put Gehry in the context of LA. And once you've read it, you can't pull the two apart anymore. That was wonderful. But my question is really about the writing. And you describe Gehry's house as a tornado. It's a very nice description. And once one has read this piece, the impression is a bit the same, that one has been caught in a tornado, and then one asks oneself, what happened? And I find the piece very revealing about both you and the work of 6A. And I was wondering whether you might say something about maybe how the piece was written, and maybe more generally how you write.
So that piece was written in a few different settings. In fact, it was started in LA. We were in LA, as I said before, our son lives in LA, so we were visiting him for Christmas, and it started on our son's kind of dining room table, because literally having just seen some of the things, it was like, okay, just do it now. So that's where the beginning. And then left it for a while and then came back to it. So the process was, for that one, was quite fragmented, but it was always done, you could say, away from the office. So I find it quite difficult to write if we are in a very intense period at work. It's sort of somehow you need to clear some mind space because it's I'm quite slow. I write slowly, so often on holiday there'll be little things, but generally it stays quite apart from. I think when we're fully engaged at work, we've usually got many projects all being processed simultaneously. Whereas I think with writing, you have to kind of be able to think about one thing and only one thing for an extended period. But yeah, so the Gehry one, I think, had been gestating for quite a while. And also we did a project actually in what was our old studio a few years ago, which was connecting two old workshop buildings together, which was actually built by John Perkins, and slightly perversely, I remember we're insisting that it's kind of slightly twisted, tornado-ish, this little homage to Gehry, to the of using 38mm thick timber sections, which is 1.5 inches, which is the typical LA one. And I remember John, or the carpenter working for John, goes, look, it's much easier if you just use 50mm. You know, that's what, you get them at Travis Perkins. It's kind of cheaper. I was like, no, it's got to be 1.5 inch. It's got to be LA style. And after a little bit of like, that seems slightly perverse, actually, and it was kind of things on a kind of very jaunty angle. It's so nicely made, and every time we come down the stairs now, is where the kind of one roof plane meets the wall, and there are these kind of quite complex geometries. And it's just every time there's a little bit of pleasure about the cut, getting the two-way kind of angle cut, just so. So I think that was happening kind of at the same time as thinking about the piece. So it was actually, there was a work in progress as a piece of construction, and then there was also then the piece which was written actually for another book, which this is totally coincidence. We hadn't planned this, but the piece was written for a book by Johan Dellin, who's a photographer, which actually came out this week. I just got
Yeah, there you go.
There you go. So that's the book. I got that text 2 days ago, and that's and it's also got it's really interesting because basically it's an expanded version. So it's many more photographs. It's 5 projects, and it's also got an essay by Hilary Sample, the American architect, which is really interesting because she's writing about the same thing, but as an American architect, and she basically doesn't seem to find it quite as fascinating as I do. Yeah, and but that's I don't know. I'm not sure if I fully answered your question there.
Hey, I was in Milton Keynes today, and I kind of felt like there's something very foreign about it, and perhaps more specifically, there's something quite American about the road structure. I was wondering if you found yourself kind of drawing parallels between Los Angeles and Milton Keynes.
Yeah, no, they were good. Yeah, I like that one. Yes, in at least in our mind. So there is actually there are relationships between Milton Keynes and the American city at several layers. So they were really, the designers of Milton Keynes were really interested in the whole theories of mobility of, I think it was Weber, the kind of West Coast urban theorist. So that's kind of recorded as part of the kind of genesis. Also, a lot of the architects who worked in the Milton Keynes Development Corporation, many of them had worked in America, and some of them in Mises' office. And apparently, now this is getting slightly more apocryphal, but when we were doing the project, we spent quite a bit of time with Christopher Woodward, who's kind of one of the architects of the shopping building, which is an absolutely extraordinary building. And he had said that, and I don't remember, this isn't just being kind of coy about naming people, I don't remember who it was, but one of them had worked on a school in Mises' office in Chicago and had come back with all the working drawings, like a copy of all the working drawings of this school. And when they were working on the shopping building, apparently when they had a kind of detailing question that they couldn't resolve, they would always refer back to these drawings, like for a balustrade or for the proportions of the fin of a glazing section or something like that. So there is, you could say there is quite a lot of American, both theory, but also American building practice, kind of, but I would say quite implicitly encoded in it. I don't think it's kind of, I think it would be difficult to go, it's that. But I think you're right that if you go to Milton Keynes, you leave Milton Keynes, you might have a feeling that you've got a bit close to America. America in Buckinghamshire, which...
That's a good question. I think we probably have time for one last question, and then we can do this a bit more informally over a drink. So one last question? Well, if not, I will urge you all to join us next door. I think I cannot plug this heavily enough because, again, it's a very good read. I've read it more than once now. So, but Tom, I think, from all of us, thank you so much. I think for me, it's a very personal thing. We've known each other a long time, and I can see what I think is most important is the reoccurrence of these obsessions. And they reoccur both in our conversations and in the work that you've been producing over many, many years. And there's something about also valuing the things that interest you when you feel that you're really very young and don't know very much, and to understand that those things keep coming back and they keep becoming relevant, if not more relevant, as you understand them further or misunderstand them further. And I think this is a wonderful illustration of just that, a very timely moment. Maybe we need to launch the other book as well, no? But please then join us for a drink next door and pick up a book, and we can talk a bit further. But Tom, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Ingrid. Thank you very much.